Welcome to Mutually Assured Conversation. I'm here with Thomas777, a man who probably doesn't need any introduction for a small subset of people. Thomas, you've been on a lot of podcasts talking about history and politics, which you have, to be honest with you, quite insane knowledge of, to be honest with you. But something that you've mentioned a couple times is your sort of religious background. Saying offhand that you're a Calvinist or you were raised in a certain way. I thought that was quite interesting. It's kind of something that again, you offhand mentioned, but didn't really get deep into. One of the things you said is that you were raised Presbyterian. So I think that can mean a couple of different things, right? So there's kind of like the cultural religious stuff, and there's also the practicing religious stuff. To give kind of example from my perspective, I would say that I come from a very religious, atheist like family. So like not at all religious practicing, but growing up in rural England and going to the rural schools there, it was very Anglican in orientation. They drill the Lord's Prayer into your head. I'll never forget that. You sing hymns every day. One of the schools I went to in a village, we went to the church down the road every day and did various things there. So I think that's kind of an interesting tension there. So would you say you're more of a like cultural Presbyterian, or would you say you're more of like a practicing Presbyterian?
Well, it's like one of the reasons why I cite E. Michael Jones a lot. He's a German Irish type guy. He's down in Indiana. Big Catholic kind of social theorist. He was making the point that in America, if you're white, like your confessional heritage, like is your culture. Like even people who aren't particularly active in church, like there really is like a culturally like the center Protestant outlook, and there really is like a Catholic outlook. And that's true. Okay, I mean there's other things in the mix too when you're talking about discrete American populations, but generally that's the way it breaks down. Like especially in policy terms. America is basically a kind of battle between like Catholics, the center Protestants, and Jews. Like that's just the way it is. Like, and like the race issue kind of obscures that in people's minds. But there's a lot of different types of Presbyterian congregations. Mine was very Calvinist, very conservative. But I think that to understand America, particularly white America, you've really got to kind of understand like the dissenter tendency, like like the American South, for example. I mean, it was ruled by like a bunch of high church, like Episcopalian types, but like the rank and file and people like Stonewall Jackson himself. I mean, they were very much, like Calvinist Presbyterian types or other congregational dissenters, like all in sundry. And this kind of strange like paradigm in America where you find people who are basically anti-government, basically anti-authority, but are very, very socially right wing. I mean, I consider myself part of that stock, not just, like in terms of like my ethnos and race, but, like my ethical viewpoint. That's basically what informs, what came to like inform my worldview. And I mean, I grew up in this like massive metropolitan area where, everybody was basically like an immigrant. Everybody was like Catholic or Jewish, and a handful of like Orthodox guys and like Asian people. But I mean, the point is, like, I was always very aware of this because like I didn't grow up in like rural Alabama or something. Like I grew up in Chicago, and about half my time I spent in Los Angeles, which was very different. But I was equally like a minority on the ground there. So maybe that gave me like a stronger sense of these things. But frankly, like most of the right wing is, at least in this country, is like the perception you get online is that it's like a bunch of Catholic guys who don't particularly like the culture here, and that is part of it. But the core, I would say, is very Protestant, like where these ideas were emergent from, because I mean it's a very dissenter Protestant idea that whatever the government's up on doesn't really concern you in like moral terms, and if it collides with if it collides with the natural law, like to hell with it, I've got no obligation to abide it. That's more complicated if you're Catholic. I'm not saying that to say something bad about Catholics. It's just in theological terms and in doctrinal terms, it just gives rise to like a different sort of quagmire. Like I'm constantly running up against people who are like, oh, if you're like this Bible believing Protestant, like how can you be right wing and like believe in like what you do? It's like because politics isn't this godly thing. I mean, like the world's a fallen place. You're going to be involved in activities that God probably would not approve of. I mean, that's not this idea that like everything you do must be like a godly thing or like must not be tainted by the corruption of the worldly. Like that's not realistic,
Mhm.
and nowhere in Scripture is that dictated. I mean, that doesn't mean you have carte blanche to do whatever the hell you want, and as long as like your end is, as long as the end you have in mind is legitimate or moral, like at all. But I mean, this idea that somehow there has to be some convergence between politics and like inner moral life, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, I hope that wasn't too scattershot, but that's basically the way I'd characterize it.
I think that makes perfect sense. And I mean, before I kind of get into it here, you're going to have to really interrupt me if I ask any stupid questions or say any
No, it's
stupid
okay.
statements. I'm not like as scripturally like well read. Like I said, like practicing atheist pretty much when I was younger. But what you're saying about dissenters is really important. And just to give kind of my perspective, being part of the stock that was left behind in the mother country, right, is
Right.
that you have the progenitor of Presbyterianism, John Knox, right, which is part of that dissenter, the original dissenter seed over in Scotland. But Anglicanism was sort of, obviously you can say all you want about Henry VIII, but I don't think that kind of tells the whole story of Anglicanism. I think it definitely appeals to the stock that was more middle of the road and was left behind,
Well,
which I think.
yeah. No, Anglicanism's complicated. It's very complicated, and especially like I was thinking of that. I can't remember his name, but one of the early on when things went to hell in Northern Ireland, like one of the early loyalist shot callers. He was this big Anglican, and he'd actually been in the British Army, and it wasn't clear if he took up the cause of if he took up the loyalist cause on grounds that he was some kind of intelligent spook, or if he actually believed this. But yeah, it was. I think of Anglicanism as kind of the great compromise, So my point is, it was weird to see a guy of that heritage like getting involved in like loyalist extremism, because you wouldn't think that, because they're kind of the consummate. Yeah, and I mean, I don't think Anglicanism's theologically impoverished at all, like some people do. I don't relate to it because it's not my faith, but it makes perfect sense too if you look at the British Empire and how it developed really from like the 18th century onward. Like that is like the faith of the empire. That makes sense. Like there's got to be some kind of high church element to that, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. But yeah, that's what's interesting. I've met other English guys who kind of attest to the same thing you did. Like they're like, oh yeah, my mom and dad, they were basically atheists, but I always, they can tell you all about the Book of Common Prayer, and like they talk about like going to church on Christmas and stuff. It was like still like a big thing.
Yeah.
It's like a weird dichotomy. But yeah, go ahead. I just wanted to insinuate that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The historical stuff, like the Book of Common Prayer stuff. I would maybe argue that's more to do with the school system, because there's still a lot of the kind of like Tudoristic propaganda in there, like talking about
Ah,
how Fox's Book of Martyrs, all that sort of stuff. If you do a bit of history in an English school, you get taught all that stuff.
yeah, yeah,
But it's interesting, because this is something I've only really kind of accepted recently, that is, even though outwardly and on censuses and all this sort of stuff, lots of English people say that they're atheist, right? They still, and this is definitely a thing I've got from E. Michael Jones, is they still think in Anglican ways, if that makes sense.
yeah,
Like
very
there's
much
still
so.
that sort of middle of the road. To criticize it, I would say kind of twee morality to it. And like you said, it's strange because it doesn't lend itself to the same sort of extremism that Protestantism and Catholicism lends itself to.
Yeah, and that's the way. Yeah, and it's also too. I mean, the process by which sovereignty was divested from Rome to Northern Europe. I mean, that's incredibly complicated, and that spans like 1,000 years. But there's no way. Um, there's no. I mean, there's like the UK had to secede from Rome's orbit in very concrete terms, but while still remaining like basically Catholic in some key ways. I mean, that's not to say that the entire Anglican right is just some kind of like political compromise, but they're if you're going to run an empire, there's going to be you can't splendidly divorce theology from imperial doctrine or optics or anything else. I mean, it's complicated. It's like easy. It's easy for people like me to like look at Anglicanism and be like, well, that's just a set of political compromises and kind of superficial alibis. But I mean, the political situation, I mean, did dictate that. And I mean, there is something people actually bother to read Anglican theology. Like, I'm not talking about the stuff now that's like written by 90-year-old guys that nobody cares about. I mean, the stuff really from kind of the zenith of the empire, it's pretty interesting. I mean, whether you agree with it or not, it's pretty thorough. These guys did know scripture, you know. So yeah, I think plus, dude, there's something of I think to some degree, like in America, you're still supposed to nominally believe in God. So like people don't go around saying they're atheists, but in Europe, including the UK, you're supposed to say that. I wonder how many of these people in the UK, that's something they say to pollsters or to people, who contact them for the purpose of these kinds of sociological surveys without actually feeling it. I mean, I don't know because I'm not on the ground there. But I speculate too. I take that with a grain of salt. Like in America, you're supposed to be a liberal, but also say you believe in God. Like in the UK, you're supposed to say like, "Oh, I don't follow religion. That's retrograde and that's not progressive." But I mean, it's just a thought. You'd know better than I. But I speculate that has something to do with it too.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, and I'm not sure what the reason for this is because, I mean, in our kind of initial back and forth before we had this discussion, there was a lot of talk about the particularism of Presbyterianism and how you think it leads to a more, you said, integrated worldview. But it's interesting, just to give a comment on the current state of the UK, at least, is there is actually quite a dedicated, there's quite dedicated religious sects, but they tend to be in minority communities.
Yeah, and that what's also there's a weird paradigm. I've thought about this too. Like one of the guys, um Alan Sorel, I think, the French guy, like he's generally like kind of a satirist, but he started writing on politics and made a bunch of people upset. He writes a lot about multiculturalism and the French experience and how it impacts identity. And he made the point that, one of the ironies is that, when France kind of quit being the outlier in terms of European integration and took on, the kind of social engineering regime that the rest of the EU did, including flooding the French homeland with immigrants, they had the effect actually of really kind of solidifying like French white identity, like among the people who were like, not wealthy enough to kind of move to greener pastures to escape the consequences of that thing. So I mean, basically, he was saying that like by the mid 21st century, like you're like the white plurality that's left in France is going to be far more radicalized than a century before, and I think that that's true. But that also, if you're colliding with people who are Muslims or who or who are Hindus or who follow what in our view would be like a strange sect of Christianity, like Orthodoxy, like you're gonna start asking questions, existential questions about your own kind of like political and cultural life. And yeah, I think that may inspire more than a few people in statistical terms to kind of like recommit themselves to their faith. Like honestly, like it's one of the weird kind of that's part of the disengagement I think of people who truly are kind of like the standard bearers of globalism, like in policy terms. Like it's like okay, if the best way to guarantee people aren't really gonna like abide the liberal program is to like force them to like attend integrated schools or like force them to like live among people who kind of naturally would not have much affinity for each other. That's kind of like a guaranteed way to like inundate them with like some kind of racial consciousness. It's just yeah, and like I said, it's hard to I'm around a lot of Irish in the old country because there still is like a lot of European immigration to Chicago from like east and west. You do run into Irish people, you do run into a lot of Poles, obviously, but a mix of others. There's more Dutch and more Germans here, like from the old country than you think too. But I do not run into a lot of like Englishmen, just because there's like not a lot of them here. And a fair amount of the Irish guys I meet, I mean, they do go to mass. They seem like as Catholic as like any of their like American brethren. But I don't know if that's because it's kind of like I said, it's kind of the thing to do here. Like even liberals here like go to church in some like nominal way. But it's hard to say. But I speculate, like I said, as time goes on, I think I think English atheism may not be long for this earth. But I mean, who knows?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that kind of maybe it's what a lot of religious people are longing for, that sort of return to that religiosity. It seems like, I mean, it's something, like I said, that at least with Anglicanism, you have that sort of twee morality that's still sticking around. With the liberal prots, you definitely have a sort of morality which is a weird transfiguration of Protestant, morality, but in the form of liberalism or progressivism, which are, I don't know, a philosopher I like called Nick Land just calls them different sects of Protestantism. I don't know what you think about that, but I think it's a possibility that could very well happen. I mean, I couldn't, in one of my books, I called it, I couldn't think of any other way of describing it. And I kind of have taken aback a lot of the stuff I wrote on Christianity because I think it was pretty scripturally unfounded, but I couldn't think of anything else to call it but the Afterglow West, because there is that sort of, that glow is still there.
Right. Well, it's also too, there was a weird, something peculiar happened.
I don't say, I say that as someone who considers myself more of a philosophical skeptic or agnostic, but
No, I understand.
I say glow in a positive way because a lot of my closest friends are Christians because I
No, I
really like
understand.
Christians. I like the way they act. It's very strange because I don't know. It's almost like, my utopia would be I could just go on being who I am, but everyone else is Christian and behaves in a Christian way.
Well, something really strange happened. I'm always making this point to people, like, because, I write a lot about the Second World War. I mean, obviously, because I'm basically a revisionist author, and I write a lot about the first half of the 20th century. People are always invoking, whether it's Hitler's table talk or whether it's guys like Anthony Ludovici or whether it's, some of these guys are in the orbit of the Italian fascist movement. Everybody's like, oh, but all these guys were atheists. It's like, you got to understand, in the first decades of the 20th century, people just thought religion was dead. Like, no one thought that was good or bad. It was just like an existential reality. People were like, this is like the machine age. What's going to come next is some kind of planned society. If you're right wing, like, how do you guarantee, the posterity of your race or ethnicity? But this idea that everything is mechanistic, everything is biology, religion doesn't animate people anymore. That's the way everybody thought, and that started to change dramatically, really in the 1970s, and that's one of the reasons it was such a big, it caused huge concern in the Soviet Union when two things happened. When the Grand Mosque in Saudi Arabia was seized by Sunni extremists, and when the Iranian Revolution popped off. Like, nobody thought like an Islamic revolution was going to happen, and then it did. Okay, I mean that, but so it's not like the early 20th century wasn't like now. Like, it was just, even if you were somebody, like, people lamented this, but in large part, but it was just the way people thought things were, and that's why Marxist Leninism was able to captivate people's fascination, because it's just like, well, this is the way of like the new world. Like, it's that, like, the degree to which people thought in these kinds of like futurist, like techno materialist terms, like, they can't be overstated. And even that's one of the reasons why, when Hitler and Mussolini did speak publicly, they'd invoke providence, but they do it like cautiously, and that's why, because they wanted to say like, hey, look, we're still like a God-centric movement. We believe in kind of like, the mystery of life's origin and the sacred, but they didn't want to push it too hard. I mean, that's the way everybody thought. I mean, which might seem weird, but that's the way it was. So I think just the fact that nowadays it's kind of considered, at least in America, it's kind of considered like uncouth if like you never ever go to church or like declare yourself an atheist. That's kind of looked down upon. That, like, even among like liberals, okay, like, that represents like a huge change from a century ago, and in historical time, a century is like, I mean, like nothing. So I mean, that's significant, okay, because basically a huge amount of the Western world did like a 180 from the way things were, not that long ago. That's something to keep in mind, I think. I realize it's different for people in the EU and the UK.
Yeah, I suppose that sort of the assumption of, I guess, for lack of a better term, I'd say the death of God, right, in the early 20th century, and the kind of, oh, this thing is actually still there in the form of Islamic revolutions or whatever in the 70s. Do you think that's a uniquely continental slash Eastern European problem, or does it have its parallels in what happened in the US?
I mean, I think it's global, quite literally, not just because not just because not just because of nascent globalism at the time, but also just, I mean, people, nothing truly happened in once after World War II, nothing truly happened in isolation anymore. Like even long before the information age, like even just when it was radio and print, kind of like and there was a nascent kind of visual component through television. The way information it wasn't even just the way information traveled at that point. It was people's conceptual horizon. Like nothing truly happened in isolation anymore. So even if something was happening in like the Middle East, or like far behind the Iron Curtain, or in North Africa, or like places that we'd in kind of the global North look at as like being primitive. Like the fact that if millions of people are being animated around a theological imperative that still like had tremendous power, and like like I said, that's why there's testimony from the minutes of like Kremlin meetings of like the truly like inner party, and Andropov and Usmanov and these guys like talking about the Islamic Revolution like in the eve of the disaster they got into in Afghanistan, and talking about how like what the fuck is this? This is a big problem, like, and why is this happening? This shouldn't be happening, like, and that was the degree to which and I mean the common man like saw that too. Like I really believe that. And that's why it's not an accident why like Jimmy Carter getting elected like at the same time. Like Jimmy Carter was basically like a lay preacher, and like people make fun of him, and I think it's somewhat like misguided the way people trash his presidency because I think I don't think he was a great president by any stretch, but he was basically a moral guy, and some of the command and control reforms he implemented as regards strategic things were very important. But I mean, people got around Carter because he was basically like the Billy Graham of like U.S. presidential candidates. I mean, that could not have happened 20 years previously. Okay, and even and close more proximate to where you're at. Despite the fact that it was couched initially in kind of like Marxist Leninist language, I mean, it became clear by the time of poor Bobby Sands, martyring himself. Like the IRA's war was a religious war. Okay, I mean, and Billy Wright, the loyalist, made that point. He's like, when I was in the Maze prison, I looked at these Republicans and I realized these guys are holy warriors. We got a problem because there's a lot of Bobby Sands in Belfast. Like it's not this idea that religion had just like left the West entirely. Like that, all these things prove that incorrect, in my opinion. Like I said, it's not an accident. This stuff all happened like around the same time. Like it's not accidental at all. I mean, I think that's important to consider.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I suppose this is kind of one of my own, I would say, argue like philosophical observations, but I kind of have a theory that all these sorts of dogmatisms are in this, in a human sense, they're religious, right? So I would argue that although we've already mentioned that politics is definitely very much a thing of this world, and it's not a traditionally theological thing, but again, like the unholy alliance between the IRA and the socialists in Britain, for example, and all the various weird offshoots of dialectical materialism, they have that weird religiosity, and I'm not sure how, other than that death of God left a vacuum, and something else had to come in and give that sort of that dogmatic thing, which I think that humans yearn for. I'm not sure if you agree with that.
Well, I agree with what Carl Schmitt. I talk a lot about Carl Schmitt, especially the younger guys, because they read him a lot. I mean, which is dope. Like I didn't start reading Carl Schmitt until I was probably in my 30s. I mean, part of that's the internet, but it's also I think younger dudes are just more like intellectually rigorous than I was at their age, and that's great. I mean, but Schmitt made the point that all politics is conceptually theological, and I mean Hobbes made that point too. I mean, even if you're talking about people who like the PIRA or the Bolsheviks of 1917, the way man views his relationship to authority is at base theological. Okay, just maybe whether I mean even if you don't believe in God, people one would acknowledge that. I mean maybe that's like a sociobiological kind of thing. Man's hardwired to think that way. So yeah, I mean that's absolutely the case. But so I mean, yeah, and I mean Schmidt literally wrote an essay that later was extended to book form called Political Theology, and it wasn't just some metaphor. Like he was literally saying that, you know, this isn't just a nuance of collective psychology or political sociology. It's a real thing, and basically like the subtext of it is that states like the Soviet Union will stand and fall on their ability to insinuate um this kind of animating mythology into every aspect of life. And at that time too, I mean, the state loomed way larger in people's lives, and that seems strange to people now because it's like, oh, but there's the panopticon and nobody has privacy anymore. That's true, but like nobody looks at the government as like this 10-foot tall thing that just kind of is insinuated into everything. Like, and that you better believe in like the first half of the 20th century, people did. Like it just the government had cachet that just doesn't know, and you can see that in everything from kind of the way people talk disdainfully about public authority to the fact that you know even regimes that are supposedly at the top, like the United States, like can't attract like the best men anymore. Make the point to people like guys like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, whether you like these guys or not, they are kind of like at the top of the food chain. And 40, 50 years ago, these guys would be like working for the Department of Defense, or they'd be like, working on SDI, or they'd be heading up some political action committee, that was involved in like applying the sciences to some kind of national imperative, be it, of a defense oriented thing or, of a nominally, kind of like civilian project, relating to space or something. The fact that like none of these guys will go near government tells you that like, well, government just does not have the clout that it did at all. But yeah, the fact remains that no matter how deteriorated or degraded or no matter how like ill-omened people view public life as, or the personalities involved in government, like political matters still, like, yeah, they are intrinsically theological, and that's one of the reasons people get so upset. Like, that's why people proselytize about these things. That's why I make the point to people a lot. It's a bit different in Europe and in the UK, but in America at least, these kind of crazy white people who go around, kind of demanding everybody abandon what they view as, racist ideas. These people are descendants of John Brown. They're these kind of crazy people who think that they can bring about this sort of like apocalypse that'll result in this sort of like telluric utopia, if they eradicate, racism or whatever. Now, there's no basis in scripture, and like that's crazy, and it's actually idolatrous according to the letter of the Bible. But they don't care. This is like their interpretation. They're committed to this, and that's why they get so angry. It's because it's not just like a policy view to them. It's like this absolute moral imperative. So yeah, you're absolutely right, and it is odd. It seems like it wouldn't fit these two tendencies together. But yeah, I believe that's why.
Yeah. And it's a weird, unique thing that I think is unique to probably the 21st century. I mean, we're still pretty early on in it, but it's weird how people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, they fill the theological space, whether they are to be, the positive theological, they're like, they're God on earth sort of thing, or whether they're the devil, they're evil catalysts or whatever. I think it's very interesting to have that duality, and it's like within the same society, they fill the same roles.
Yeah, it's
but I did
weird.
want to steer this back in a slightly more theological direction, mostly for my own knowledge, really. So I'm very interested about the philosophical side of Calvinism, but just to kind of start from the top and work our way down, what's your understanding of Presbyterianism?
I mean, what it is that me personally,
again, like I said, if that's a stupid question, then that's a fair answer.
No, not at all. It's just, I mean, essentially that the inner witness is the true judge, and the inner witness is how man communes with God, and we come to know God through reason and in other ways. But basically, I mean, that's through Scripture and through the inner witness. I mean, that's what you must abide, in order to be right with God. It's not what a deacon says, or not what I'm trying to be delicate in my language because I don't want people to think I'm being some kind of sectarian bigot or something. It's not. It's the man's direct communion with God is absolutely paramount. Okay, and that, like I said, that comes to us through the inner witness and through Scripture. And one must always keep in mind that the world is irredeemably fallen. Okay, I mean, it's this notion that we've either got to like retreat entirely, and live some kind of pseudo monastic life because everything else is tainted by worldliness. I mean that's a cop out, and that's incredibly misguided, and that's also not what God would have for us. But alternatively, this idea that we've got to like repair the world and like make it godly. I mean that's not just a fool's errand. I mean that's hubris to the point of idolatry. Okay, um, so it's the and I mean plus two, there man is a limited participant in the world and its affairs. I mean I make that point to people a lot, not just young guys who are like we got to do something in political terms, but just like people generally. I mean, it's when old school like particularly like Pentecostal Baptist types like say like trust in God. 'Cause that's kind of like their mantra. Like they mean that quite literally. They mean like you don't really impact things. And even like collectively, like man doesn't. I mean that's important to bear in mind. And as I age, I take that more and more seriously. And there's one must. I mean, one's got to account for these things and abide them, like I said, without deciding that it's some sort of that it's that whether that is some sort of pretext for like retreating from the world entirely.
Yeah.
And I mean, basically, if you look at the politics of the right, I mean, in brass tacks terms, the stuff that it's basically like practical reason. Okay, it's like morality is practical reason. This idea that without a communitarian impulse, like nothing related to the good can be realized. I mean, that's obviously, ethnic homogeneity is a precursor to that. Like it's this idea that like oh, political life is totally at odds with scripture. I mean, that's not really true. I mean, even if it were, it's like that wouldn't really matter because again, like we're talking about two different things. But I don't think they're as far removed as people think they are. And it's a lot of this stuff is I mean, metaphysical things and talking about you know talking about God is always. I mean, obviously these are like huge questions, but a lot of people get kind of bogged down in minutia that doesn't really matter in my opinion. What I mean? Like so to me, long story short, yeah, it's scripture and the inner witness. I mean, to me that's what my faith is to me. I'm sure there's people who say that like I'm a fucking barbarian who's not doing it right. Whatever. Like you know,
Yeah,
I believe in Protestant and take it or leave it.
sure. I was trying to understand the inner witness, and I mean, this is me trying to connect it to some sort of concept that I understand. But is it analogous to conscience, like your relationship with
Yeah,
God
I
is
mean,
your?
it's more tied to Christianity. Like the Lutherans have their own kind of interpretation of this.
Yeah.
German theology, I find it kind of weird. I mean, not in negative terms. But there's a tradition of mysticism there, from like Meister Eckhart to like Martin Luther
Sure.
himself to Martin
Yeah.
Heidegger. And a lot of it, I mean, it finds its zenith in Lutheranism, but even a lot of German Catholicism is like pietist in nature. And again, like whether you view it as conscience, whether you view it as a combination of conscience and mind and practical reason, like man knows like what the moral path is. Like he'll choose to deviate from that, or choose to make hash with it, or choose to sin, purposefully because he doesn't care, or because he'd prefer to like wallow in his own depravity than try to rise above it. But um basically you kind of know God by like abiding that pious tendency within the self. And I
Mm.
mean it's given we give it's given form by intellectual learning from scripture, obviously, and just from man's capacity to reason. But that's basically the core of it. You're not absolved by a priest, or you don't need to seek like moral instruction from a deacon or something. It's these things are basically hard coded like into like the rational soul, if you want to like consider it the way like the Greeks did. The Greeks like had like ideas of like different elements of soul or whatever. I don't read ancient Greek, so I mean I can't properly interpret what the perfect analogy would be, but the way one should think of it as a Christian, I believe, where the soul is like an integrated phenomenon, is like the rational aspect of the soul is the inner witness in a large part, and
Sure.
practical morality derives from reason. And that's what separates man from animals, among other things. So that's kind of that's the way I understand it, at least. And again, admittedly, I'm not a theologian. I'm just like I'm just a guy who goes to church and like abides scripture as best I can.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm just a guy with a bunch of books as well. I don't know. Just maybe this will be a point of disagreement, but I wouldn't be surprised about that. Being people who have different convictions, right? I think that some people have a conscience, and maybe it's just because some people choose not to follow their conscience. But to be honest with you, there's some ways in which I've seen people act, personal life, or even just through whatever, that I'm just like, there's no way that person has a conscience. I think it would be one of my beliefs that I don't think everyone has that conscience. And just to tack onto that as well, as a second point, is I don't, and again, maybe this is not a disagreement, but I kind of disagree with the view of morality or ethics or whatever you want to call it as a rational thing. I don't think at base humans are rational beings, and I think that ethical judgments ultimately come from just that deontological dogmatism. And I don't say that in a bad way at all. I think that's what we need to ground ourselves somewhere. I mean, someone who's very good on this, and not philosophically, but Dostoevsky's very good on this, because you can think of very good reasons that certain people should be killed, right? You can think of very good reasons for that to happen, but you have
the way I look at
it, say that murder is wrong, right?
I essentially accept. I mean, whether if you're talking about the man as like a moral agent, if you want, if you want to take the materialist view, or even just like the a metaphysical but non-religious view, you can substitute mind for soul if you want. But let's break down like the inner human consciousness, like whether it's mind or soul, as like reason, will, and passion. Okay, and that's what Freud was a fraud in all kinds of ways, but among other things, like Freud appropriated that model that the Greeks gave us, and he transposed it as a id, superego, ego. Okay, but I think most people would agree, reason, will, passion, basically is the structure of like man's inner impulse. Okay, and the only thing that facilitates, I agree, like morality is not just synonymous with reason or with and it's not just some iteration of rationality. It's far more complicated and nuanced than that. And also, I think it originates from a different source. But at the same time, the only way you can come to know morality is through reason. You don't come to know morality through passion. Okay, like let's say a beautiful girl and you want to be with her. Like passion dictates you should just take her. Like will gives you the motivation to do that. Like reason says no, that's not right. And that's how you come to. That might seem like an extreme example, but that whatever you don't come to know morality just by abiding your passions, or just by following through on things you desire that you have the will in order to accomplish. It's like through reason you come to know restraint, among other things. Okay, and that goes beyond just that. That goes if man collectively was only behaving himself because he was afraid of being punished, you still wouldn't have a functional society, because even in this panoptic age, you can still do a lot of things outside of the prying eyes of your fellow man. Okay, so obviously there's some mechanism by which man learns that moral behavior by way of resort to reason, even if it's just purely a self-interested judgment. I think that's important to consider, but more more completely, an understanding of the self as people become too invested in the self, can't handle they can't handle the fact that they're going to die. Like I really believe that. It's not about being fearless or something like that, but understanding that all things, come from God, and understanding that, like life is fleeting, and I mean, and it's not particularly significant in an individual capacity. Um, that you come to realize that these worldly things just aren't important. Whether you're talking about like material wealth or like sex or like clout or like anything else, you just like stop caring about these things in any kind of profound way. And reason facilitates that as well, because the man who's not capable of reason, even if he had a basic moral conscience, so it was not it was not moral to harm others. I mean, like he's that this still wouldn't indicate a tendency towards contemplation of the divine or anything like that, or like a developed moral understanding of the relationship of the self to the absolute, or like any of this stuff. So thus the emphasis on reason. Reason is not axiomatically synonymous with rationality. I mean, rationality derives from reason, but there are unknowable things that we come to know through reason in some basic incomplete capacity. So I mean, I realize that might be very incomplete of an explanation, but it's the best one I can proffer.
Yeah. I mean, my explanation was quite incomplete as well, but it feels like it's mostly conceptual differences rather than any fundamental disagreement. But I'm actually very glad that you mentioned the fleeting nature of life there, and the fact that a lot of the materialist philosophies are like cope for the fact that we're going to die one day, right? So just to kind of move on to a topic that's related to that, did want to talk about the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. So I've done some study on that before, and obviously I caught up on it for our conversation here. But I was just kind of wondering what your understanding of that was.
I mean, the brass tacks of it is, how can God not have knowledge of any given man's salvation? So, I mean, when people act like this is such a brutal doctrine, how can you think that? It's like, but metaphysically, like, how could it be otherwise? Like, I'm not trying to like spin riddles on people, but I mean, it doesn't. The idea is, and plus two, I mean, the idea is that people are people are motivated to do good. I mean, according to their basic inner constitution. It's like if you're racking up, if you're like a football coach, like racking up points in the win-loss columns in terms of your like moral behavior, and if there's more in the win column, you're saved. But if there's more in the competing column, you're damned. Like that doesn't. We're not really talking about a moral calculus there. We're talking about self-interest, kind of reduced to absurdity and as applied like a metaphysical judgment. But the Calvin wasn't suggesting some kind of like elitist paradigm either, where like the elect should view themselves as as like better than anybody else or something like that. And plus, I mean, one can't even know if like they're elect or not. I mean, there's basic indicators that would tend in that direction. But it's just the way I look at it is not. A lot of people outside the faith like make a huge deal about that. I'm not saying you. I'm saying like people generally like come at it with a punitive view to begin with. Like this is just some kind of like smug like rationalization for a sense of superiority. Like that's not it at all. Like I pose the question again, like how could God not know of like the fortunes of any given man, or like if any man's like saved or not? Like nothing is like a mystery to providence or like an unknown. That's the issue. So this idea that I can somehow alter like the time at which I die, or like I can alter like my God's outside of time and space. Okay, and God is all knowing, so it's not like God doesn't know what's going to occur in a million years or even tomorrow. I mean that's the way to understand it. Like all things are simultaneous to the mind of God, if we can even like anthropomorphize God in that way. Like that's the way to understand it. But it's liberating, because I make the point to people a lot. A lot of people don't know this, but I guess because it's like obscure Cold War trivia. But Robert Dubuisson, the Salvadorian nationalist who fought the communist insurgency, he wasn't a Catholic. He was a born again Christian with a very Calvinist bent. and he said to an interviewer he refused to wear body armor despite being, like one of the most targeted men like in Latin America during the Cold War. And so this interviewer was like, "Why? You got a death wish?" He's like, "No." I can't. He's like, "When I die is in the hands of God. It's already been decided. Why would I worry? I'm not gonna." He's like, "I'm not gonna court death, but I'm not gonna run around and hide and move from safe house to safe house and not hold my daughter without like body armor on." He's like, that's no way to live. And he's like, that any man who does that isn't a true believer. And that like resonated with me. Like I read that as a teenager, and I'm like, wow. But that stayed with me throughout the years too. And honestly, like, I mean, it might sound weird to like invoke some paramilitary type as like understanding, the kind of true meaning of predestination. But I mean, he's a guy who lived very much like on the edge of life and death. I'd posit he understood it better than like a lot of more educated people. Okay, in concrete terms. But that's really kind of the way to understand it. But it's also, the it's a way of kind of getting perspective on worldly affairs. Like I make this point to people too. Um, the idea of Christian forgiveness, that doesn't mean that like if somebody murders your family, you want to give them a big hug and don't want them to be punished. They absolutely need to be punished, but you've like it's in the hands of God. I mean, like it's not. You gotta like let go of this kind of like this kind of like passionate intensity to like see things develop like, the way like your passions would wish for them to. I mean, it's like this applies to everything in mortal life. I mean, it's not just not just kind of the metaphysical stuff. And who and what is the author of reality, and what is any individual man or woman's ability to act as an agent of changing those things, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. I think that it causes, I think it ruffles people's feathers in the wrong way, and I think it's because there are different conceptions from different parts of Christianity. I mean, just to give some examples, right? So the fall, right? So the Genesis story seems to be based around the free will decision to disobey God, right? And then also you obviously have the fact that Christianity is going to it takes the particularism of the covenant made with the Israelites, and at least scripturally makes it universal, right? But it almost seems like this theology of the elect takes that universalism and actually makes it a new sort of particularism. I mean, I'm not really making the case for those myself specifically, but I do think those are reasons why people have
Oh,
such an issue.
the church, like the church is the new Israel, like absolutely. And like and then the new Israel is those who is the elect, and like those who are the elect doesn't depend on like having the right DNA or like the right blood, like as the case with the Israelites. I mean, that's the big difference, is that it takes what was like an idolatrous worldly um claim, to and 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 correctly posits how such things are actually determined providentially. Like that doesn't the and like in terms of like free will, like yeah, man absolutely does have free will, but like free will within the dominion of God. And like
Mm.
man can't like alter like what is authored by God with his free will. I mean, that's the way to understand it.
Mm.
I mean, yeah, like man is like a moral agent within his own life. Like obviously, like free will doesn't mean, or I mean, predestination doesn't mean that everybody is some automaton or something. But again, too, like I said, the way to understand it is that God is outside of temporal restrictions, um, and as well as like physical reality. Um, that's the way to understand it. And I mean, there is frankly like I mean, if the this the main issue with uh with things like Christianity is not particularly egalitarian, like despite what people say, or like I mean, not in like the way that they say it is, and it's that's something to keep in mind too. Like this idea that like nowhere in the Bible does it say like, oh, everybody is capable of salvation, or like everybody's going to be saved. Like quite the contrary, man. You know, I mean, like that doesn't mean you swagger around and convince yourself that you're right in the eyes of God and like your political enemies aren't. Because frankly, that's that's a Jewish conceit. But this idea that oh well, we can't condemn sin because like that's judgmental or something, or it's like no, the like one can't substitute man's judgment for that of God. You know what I mean? That's the issue. The issue isn't that like we're harming the dignity of others if we don't like include them in kind of the community of the elect or whatever. And plus, I mean, you see it all around you. Does everybody have the same fortunes in life? I mean, like, no. I mean, obviously, the world's a fallen place. Like it. That's why it's misguided when people are like, how can God allow like children to die in an earthquake? It's like because the world's basically a hell. Like you don't live in heaven. You don't live in like God's utopia, like where nothing bad is supposed to happen. And oh, this is some sort of this rebuts Christian theology because bad things happen on earth. It's like to your point, like the entire point of Christian metaphysics is that like you live in like a quasi hell basically. I mean, it's not it's not at all at odds. I mean, as Demetrius said, like the world's a giant ultra sacrifice. And this will happen over and over and over again until literally like the death of death. At which point like the elect do like ascend to heaven. You know, if you're a quantum physicist, I mean, you can argue about like how that's going to play out in terms of the cosmos and the stars, but I am not. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting the things you're saying about metaphysics, because I think that's where a lot of people, this is where a lot of the like really logical and materialist atheist arguments kind of fall over, because you're trying to understand the metaphysical container of the reality we're in by the like standards of our like demoted view of it.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
no philosophical certainty that the metaphysical truth, whatever that is, has any sort of bearing on whatever rules are set within our like corner of it. It doesn't make any sense. And again, like you say, like when when the judgment comes and the dead rise up, like, and then atheists are like, well, not all the bones that were ever of people who died are always or are still on the earth, but it's like you're not even understanding like. But actually, on that point, I was wondering if your faith's ever wavered. I was wondering if Thomas has ever had like an edgy atheist phase or anything like that.
No, I mean, there's been times where I was like less inclined to think about religious things than others, but like I never was like there is no God, like God doesn't exist. Like there's never it. Yeah, I never thought in those terms. But it's also too. I mean, like I guess part of it is like I said, like Chicago's a weird place, but like as crazy as it is, and as crazy as like even the people who are like crazy Reds here, like still view themselves as like God fearing people, like perverse as that might seem. So like I was never like immersed in a culture that was, where even as like an impressionable kid, it's not like there was like this coterie of like atheists, and like I was like, oh, maybe they're like right about things. And this, when I was a teenager, that was like, I mean, this was like the very early 90s. It was like, before like freaking consumer internet jumped off. I mean, I was like an early adapter. I didn't get the internet till like 95, 96, I mean, and it's, so, no, not really. I mean, I read a lot of Nietzsche and a lot of Schopenhauer, like when I was like in my late teens. But I also understood because I started reading that stuff because I was reading about the Third Reich and World War II. And I came to understand pretty quick. I mean, owing in part because I had some guys who were really brilliant guys who, taught me a lot about history and stuff. That like, look, like, in late modernity, if you'll forgive the terminology, like we talked about at the start of this conversation, people just viewed like religion as dying or dead. So it's not even like people like Nietzsche and in particular, but also Schopenhauer were saying like, to hell with the church, it's Jewish or it's nonsense or it's garbage or it must die. They were saying like this is where we are, and bastard child of the church as Bolshevism might be, you're going to see like many other similar iterations because religion is dying whether we like it or not as part of the historical process. And man's conceptual horizon has changed so much and like and science, which originally, was the progeny of the church, has refuted its core metaphysical doctrines and cannibalized itself. So like, what will come next? This kind of like this kind of like Hitchin style, like, I hate Christ, I hate the church, it's mean to people and homophobic. That's like a really weird thing that kind of like was a blip on the radar, at least here in like the very late 90s, very early 2000s. Then it just kind of like evaporated as quick as it was here. Like, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's really interesting because that whole new atheist Hitchin stuff is, and this is kind of, it's almost like not just a religious point, it's almost a political point. And this is where the left and right kind of fail wherever one is in charge, right? When you define yourself by being the negation of the other, you're almost just playing containment, Like it's interesting.
Yeah.
The new atheists were almost like just containment for that tendency of kind of like, intellectual life. It's really, I find that really interesting. I'm not very well read on anything, but I'm quite well read on Nietzsche. I'm just kind of interested on, like, what your thoughts are on him in general, but specifically the kind of, the project to reevaluate all values. I find it particularly interesting, especially Zarathustra. I've got my own kind of opinions about why the will's power shouldn't really be considered part of the main corpus, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on his project.
I mean, I think he's somewhat overstated in terms of his impact on real world politics. I mean, not on. He's been hugely impactful on just kind of cultural thought in general. Like, whether we're talking about like literary stuff, whether we're talking about kind of philosophically inclined like criticism. But people really misconstrue. Like I said, it's a subject for another pod, and we can talk about this another time if you want. But when Nietzsche said about Christianity, and the manner in which and like its destructive tendencies, but he wasn't saying this is some like Jewish conspiracy to bring down all that is like noble or Aryan or like elite or whatever. Like, he was not saying that at all. Like, the reason why Nietzsche posited that like the kind of the perfect man, or like the Mahdi, or like in his estimation or its equivalent, or like the Superman would be Caesar with the soul of Christ, is because if we're gonna replace moral judgment with like aesthetic judgment, and I believe that what's really interesting about Nietzsche is his metaphysics, and that's never really addressed by people. But that's the key to understanding like what he thinks should replace morality. We want Caesar with the soul of Christ because the dialectic between masters and slaves, there's something unseemly about it on both sides. And the kind of self-contained, the man who was like a truly like self-contained individual would be a Superman because he's neither master nor slave. He's a superior specimen who's like a value creator in his own right and has all the culture bearing characteristics, of the master. But he's got a tendency towards he's got a tendency towards like decency, as it were, of like the simple sort, as like a slave would, without the obsequiousness and like the weakness of mind that forces a slave to require the mastery of others in order to live. I mean, that's the way I understand it. And if you view history as a historical process, and not accidental occurrences, you've got to consider Christianity, at least in part, as an aspect of that process, and the way in which it impacted Europe's fortunes, like better and like good and bad, like they can't be avoided. So I mean, it's like I said, people can't think of Nietzsche as condemning Christianity just like as in some like outright way, or as some sort of like terrible blight upon the world. In context, what he's saying makes a lot of sense. I don't agree with it. I think it's somewhat intellectually provincial, but it's not like some crazy idea. But at the same time, too, it's not all that relevant to today, especially to an American. But we should talk about that in another episode. So it's definitely worth like it's definitely worth like a full discussion.
Yeah, something you picked up on there, which I actually haven't thought about before, is the kind of overstated political impact of Nietzsche and the fact that he's overrepresented culturally. Because obviously you have like his connection, very loose one, with the Third Reich, where they're not really, getting the subtext. They're just getting the kind of, the snippets they need. And again, like I said, have issues with the will's power and the way that was compiled, the whole issue with his sister. But it's very interesting because you don't really have good um, Anglophone translations of Nietzsche until the 60s when Kaufman and Hollingdale
Yeah.
do sort of translations. And it's
No,
fascinating.
exactly. And also, yeah, and also Hitler himself, like Schopenhauer was Hitler's philosopher.
Yeah.
I mean Hitler, he made that clear. And Hitler carried Schopenhauer with him on the Western Front. When he was as a Lanzer, and even like later in life, if you like read not just the table talk, but if you read just like Hitler's statements, um, I mean, even in some of his formal speeches, there's like Schopenhauer. You can tell this guy spent basically like his entire like youth like reading Schopenhauer. I mean, that's like, I mean, it's like so clear. Like, I don't see how, other than like a general kind of like a cosmetic like Germanness to like a lot of stuff. Like there's really no kind of philosophical convergence between, like National Socialism and Nietzsche. But yeah, we should definitely take up any or all of this stuff in a subsequent episode. I gotta raise up in a minute here, but this has been great, man. Like I really mean that. We should record again sooner rather than later.
Yeah. I barely got through any of my notes, but yeah, had a bunch of great info from you. That's really good. So yeah, usually when I talk to someone new, I have kind of like a final question for them, kind of like a
Yeah,
tongue-in-cheek one, kind of a reminder, because these conversations get really, really serious sometimes. But if you're on death row, Thomas, what would your last meal be?
my last meal, Chicago style deep dish pizza with pepperoni, onion, and giardiniera, and a 6 pack of Pepsi in glass bottles, and Lucky Strikes.
Nice. Thanks, Thomas.
No, thank you, man. This has been great. I really appreciate you.